Welcome to the Oracle Scroll. My name is Kevin Walder and I am your host, and I invite you to join my guests and myself as we discuss all things metaphysical. Welcome to episode 2 of the Oracle Scroll. Today we begin to discuss some of the tarot cards that have a bearing on our current situation in life. And the best place to begin, I believe, is with the Fool. The Fool is a bit of a misnomer. He has taken a bad rap because most people think of the Fool as something you'd want to avoid. You certainly don't want to be known as the Fool. And yet there are many aspects of the Fool that we would be very well rewarded by emulating. So the Fool is often depicted as a carefree young man. He's accompanied by his faithful dog, and he's just poised to step off a cliff while looking directly ahead and up. Some find him to be carefree. Others maybe say he's careless. But is there really a difference? Most often, it is the outcome that we are drawn to conclude the wisdom of the action at hand. This card speaks to us of an act of faith. He knows that all will be just fine, and that he is about to either learn to fly rather than fall. And if he does fall, it will be a gracious, soft landing that is precipitated by spirit. The Fool also carries an important message about living in this moment. In his current position, there is no room for looking back and no benefit to worrying about the future. This moment is the only one in which change can occur, and the Fool is a clear example of fully living that concept. Since the Fool is one of the major arcana cards, it also carries an extra weight and meaning when we find it in a spread. It tends to speak to the real question at hand. It can indicate that the real issues may be quite different from the original question that was posed. The Fool can be a strong indication of a need to step outside our comfort zone to experience the zest of living again. I say again because we all had it as children. It's time to reclaim it. Every bit of magic in our lives occurs just over that line, just outside our comfort zone. And the best things in our lives come when we are no longer operating in the safety of what we've always known. The Fool also speaks to us of trust. Though we may make every attempt to create a safe environment in which most of our experience is very predictable, there will always be those moments for which we cannot plan. And without the energy of the Fool, we find ourselves navigating those times in a much more challenging way than necessary. Introducing an element of wonder, which will allow for your growth beyond your present limitations, can be a quite energizing affair, and builds our trust in the universe. The Fool indicates that there are times in our journey when we won't have all the information we think we need, and we won't be able to control the outcome of a situation. But we cannot allow those seemingly insurmountable obstacles to stop us from moving forward. Sometimes we have to take that next step without ever really knowing whether we will land softly on a cloud or instantly sprout wings and feathers and begin to soar. When the Fool comes up in a reading, it can mean the individual is one who lives in the present, takes life as it comes without attachment, or it can be advice that the querent needs to bring more of that attitude into his or her life. I often find that the Fool arrives just in time to tell the querent that it's time to move forward using your best information. This card says to me that it is time for the querent to take those first crucial steps to proceed with clarity of vision. But no guarantees, no guarantee of the ultimate outcome. So the three questions that the Fool poses: what are you rationalizing as your reason to stay put? What step could you take, which, though it's scary, might just propel you to new heights? How will you challenge yourself to new growth? That explanation of the Fool is taken directly from my book, Tarot for Lunch, Lessons from the Cards. It is a very simple, straightforward look at the tarot, and is a great place for beginners to start. Now, I also have a project in which I am separating each of the major arcana cards especially as individuals, and beginning to think of them as individuals, as people who populate your neighborhood, people who are there to offer advice and solutions and challenges occasionally. So in the case of the Fool, I wrote an interview with the Fool. And it's rather interesting because there are some aspects of him that we don't always think about. So I'm going to read both parts since I'm here in the studio alone today. So the interviewer says, "I noticed when you came in, you were accompanied by your dog. Is this a service animal or a pet?" That's a pertinent question these days. And the Fool says, "Well, both, really. As you'll note in looking at various images of myself, he doesn't always accompany me, but is often attempting to alert me to obvious dangers. Other times he seems to just be in a playful mood and being a faithful traveling companion. No matter how you see my dog, though, he is my only truly faithful companion. He is never critical of my decisions." The interviewer asks, "The next thing I noticed is your pack you carry on your shoulder. What can you tell us about that?" "Ah," the Fool says, "well, the pack you see today is much different from the one I originally set out with on my shoulder. I thought I would need a lot of belongings to survive my journey, but I soon learned that all that stuff was more of a hindrance than a help to my journey. I really needed to be free, to move with agility, so the pack you see today holds only those things I absolutely need to get by." The interviewer says, "The next most noticeable aspect of your presence is your brightly colored and patterned clothing. Do you always dress like this?" The Fool answers, "Well, obviously not. Go back and look at some of those images. Sometimes I'm wearing nothing at all. My clothing tells a story of my heritage as a storyteller, a sage, a jester. In medieval courts, the jester was an important link to the outside world. The jester would be an entertainer and newscaster to the court. The jester was often able to convey difficult news in a way that would not anger the absolute ruler. If you think about it, we have something similar today when our late-night talk show comedians are regarded as more trustworthy newsmen than some of the more traditional journalists." The interviewer says, "So tell us more about the major arcana and how you fit in. I can't help but notice that you were designated 0. Is that significant?" And the Fool says, "Actually, it is very significant. While all the others in the major arcana have stationary, even static positions within the structure, the 0 gives me the ability to be everywhere and anywhere. Most of the time, I am acknowledged as the beginning card, but some systems put me at the end. They put me last. But I find that I am comfortable with being lost sometimes. Have you ever wandered off and rather hoped you wouldn't be found? I know that feeling very well. The interviewer asks, "Do you sometimes feel misunderstood?" And the fool says, "Oh, yes. But then, doesn't everyone? Don't we all? Some people mistake my carefree attitude for indicating a mental instability or inability. Nothing could be further from the truth. The creative mind works in mysterious ways which are often misunderstood by their peers. Just because I'm not following the traditionally accepted rules doesn't mean I'm less capable than anyone else." The interviewer asked, "How did this journey begin for you?" Oh, my. There's a story. In the beginning, I was as wobbly and uncertain as an infant taking his first steps. I often just stopped and sat down to contemplate and question my motivation. But eventually my confidence began to grow until I was certain I could take on any challenge and succeed. I found that confidence doesn't necessarily mean meeting every challenge victoriously, but rather finding you can be secure in your insecurity. There's a concept. The interviewer says, "What would you say is your single most valuable trait?" Oh, well, that's easy. It's my attitude. I am still a child at heart, and I maintain that youthful vision and wonder which keeps me grounded. I never spend time obsessing about the past or the future because my place is here and now. I depend on my intuition to direct my spontaneity, and there's a healthy dose of faith thrown into the mix as well. The interviewer says, "Shifting gears a little, tell us more about your planetary attributions." The fool says, "My pedigree, as it were. Well, my planetary attribution is Uranus, which represents non-traditional behaviors, charting one's own path. It can also represent chaos and rebellion. I think I'm comfortable with all those traits." And the interviewer says, "And your elemental attributions?" And the fool answers, "My elemental attribution is air, which is a masculine, active energy and represents clarity." The interviewer asks, "Are there any other parts of your pedigree you want to share?" And the fool answers, "Depending on the system, I am associated with the Hebrew letter Aleph, which is the beginning of the Hebrew alphabet and is derived from the Egyptian hieroglyph of the ox head, which has been a symbol of prosperity throughout history. Another symbol I'm associated with is the Nordic rune Wyn, W-Y-N, which carries a meaning of joy. And let's face it, almost every image of me depicts a joyful approach to life." The interviewer asks, "What labels hurt you?" And the fool says, "Well, we touched on this earlier, but it would have to be those which assume I am less than capable. Some see me as naive, irrational, foolish, careless, and those labels hurt sometimes, especially when they fit." And then the interviewer says, "What labels make you proud?" Well, that's easy. When people see me as I see myself, joyful, carefree, fearless, optimistic, and confident, it makes me very proud and happy. So the interviewer wraps up the interview with this last question. "Well, last but not least, where will you go from here?" And the fool, with a big smile on his face, answers, "How do I know, and why should I care? My whole purpose in existence is here and now. The future will take care of itself in that time. And I don't need to spend a single moment worrying or obsessing over what might be. You should try this for yourself sometime, but only if you are truly ready to be free. That was an interview I wrote for The Fool, and I think it wraps up and sums up much of the character that is involved in this character. And he can be a very special guide. You can use him in meditation, and his insights are valued and valuable. The second part of our episode revolves around a current affair or current affairs. And this particular one is a look at fundamentalism. This is taken from an article that I wrote some years ago about my own personal story in dealing with fundamentalism. And I'd like to share it with you now because it's extremely pertinent, especially now in our hyper-vigilant world where everyone seems to be anxious to be angry and judgmental. Perhaps it's because I was born and raised in a very fundamentalist atmosphere, surrounded by people and ideologies that were far more concerned with pointing out the differences and more concerned with finding fault with others than with celebrating what was right with any of us. This is a toxic environment in which to grow. And as a child, I questioned many times, how can we be so sure we're the only ones who know the right way? As a young man, I began to question everything I was taught in childhood. I began to question every way of thinking I had been taught. And in so doing, I instantly earned the scorn of all those who had taught me. It began to make sense to me that rather than the biblical creation account of man being created by a God, perhaps man had been the creator, and the gods were definitely in his image because man knew that image very well. Being young and impetuous, I had the audacity to believe that my new philosophy was mine alone, and I had come up with it of my own invention. Many years later, as I began the quest of spiritual awakening, I walked into a pagan bookstore and was greeted by the proprietor, who was quite willing to answer what must have been totally disconnected questions from a blind seeker. On my first visit, I bought a couple of books, which I literally devoured. I really was at that point a sponge, soaking up every bit of information I could find. A week or so later, I visited that same bookstore again, and upon walking in and finding the proprietor available, I said with a big smile, "I finally know what to call myself." I had discovered that my philosophy, my theory, had been the philosophy of those ancient people all along. It was nothing new, and it certainly wasn't mine, but I understood it in a way I had never dreamed that I would understand it. This awakening continued for some time, and, truth be told, still continues. As I attended a recent ceremony, it was brought to my attention, quite forcefully, that though we are different from other groups, different from each other as individuals, we are not self-appointed judges of anyone or any group. Years ago, I had become aware that even in alternative groups, with the philosophy of freedom and freedom of expression, there are those who can be called fundamentalists, who could tolerate no variations in how a ceremony was conducted. Those people who have learned their lessons very well, but have missed the point of allowing their heart to guide them. In my instance, I had no preconceived notions about the ceremony I was attending. I was open to receiving, I was open to experiencing, and I truly tried to approach it with an open heart. However, I found that I was distracted by a particular individual who did absolutely nothing which would be considered wrong in the conduct of the ceremony, but for some reason I felt a strong need to judge that person. It's a human nature thing. It was then that I realized that, boy, those old habits, those things you are taught, the things beaten into you as a child, they die hard. Having been raised to judge others by my own measure, having been taught to discount those who don't appreciate in the same way I do, and having been taught to focus on the differences rather than our connectedness, was my issue. And it was my issue alone. I was allowing my own inner fundamentalist to express this feeling and through this feeling, even though I never gave it voice, and I certainly wouldn't. In the ceremony, I learned in a new and perhaps most expressive way, at least in a way I can no longer ignore, that we are truly connected, one to another. Individual to individual, individual to world, individual to planet. We have no reason, and certainly absolutely no right, to judge another's offering of themselves. To do that, it would be judging ourselves as unworthy. This blocks our progress. This nullifies our belief and completely saps our power. In that ceremony, I learned that in order to move forward, I, together with all of you, together with all of them, together with everyone around this world, have to be able to embrace one another, to embrace each one's effort, to embrace each one's heart. We are living in a time of transformation. We no longer can enjoy what we might call our right to our long-held fundamentalist attitudes. We're truly one, and we need to recognize that. As this year, 2018, proceeds, we're in for still a lot of changes. We've got lots of changes on the way, some of which we expect, and some of which we have no idea how to deal with them, how to cope with them, or what to expect of them. We're going to need every bit of our talent, our ability, our personal power to get through this year, and any year in the future for that matter. So if we're wasting any of that power on old ways of thinking, judging the neighbor, and behaving in a way that we find challenging to everyone around us, then we're wasting our time and our energy that could definitely be spent in embracing our community, ourselves, and our world. The third segment of our program on this podcast is one where we consult the cards. We take questions from audience members and draw cards to come up with some sort of guidance for them. In today's question comes from Andrea. Andrea says, I am finally getting my life back together after a very messy breakup. Is the person I'm currently dating the one? My response: Dear Andrea, before I ever drew the very first card for your question, I had a strong feeling that it is still too early to tell what the long-term outcome might be for this relationship. When reading for a question like this, I most often find that the strongest indicators are about our own impressions of the situation. So I drew 3 cards to begin your reading, and they are the Two of Swords, the Queen of Coins, and the Ace of Wands. By clarification, I drew a 4th card, which was the Chariot. The very first thing I noticed about this draw is the lack of Cups cards in the reading, which indicates that the real question is less about the emotional and more about the other aspects of life. I was first drawn to the Queen of Coins, as this is the role you are now playing in your own life. You're no longer in a cooperative position where you can count on someone else to pick up the slack in the challenging times. You've taken on the complete responsibility for your life and providing for your own well-being. This is a strong position and indicates a determination to take care of business on your part. The queens in the deck are nurturing and kind while fiercely independent, and a force to be reckoned with in times of challenge. The next card to attract my attention was the Ace of Wands. This ace says that your recent experience has caused you to reinvent yourself. You have just begun to learn how to put yourself first, and it feels exhilarating as you rediscover your voice. You are just now realizing that you will never fit comfortably into that old mold again. This too can be a challenge for the wrong person. Lastly, I'm drawn to the Two of Swords, which indicates to me that both of you are weighing the situation carefully, which is a good sign. This card is saying rather forcefully that it is still too early to tell if this is the one, but if you continue to take yourself seriously, refuse to compromise on the qualities you find most important in a partner, you will not go wrong. The Chariot was drawn to clarify the Two of Swords and indicates the need to maintain balance as you continue to grow and move with the new energy you are feeling right now. So, in a nutshell, in summary, you both have a lot to learn about each other before making any kind of long-term plans. You have just begun to learn about your new identity, which means a lot more definition as you recover from your messy breakup. So give yourself some time to just enjoy the attention without being in a hurry to read more into the situation. All relationships are learning experiences, so there is no need to rush into a decision right now. Be patient with yourself, because you're just learning to appreciate your own power, and you will never give it away again. Thank you, Andrea, for your question. This brings us to the end of episode 2 of the Oracle Scroll. We thank you for joining us, and please share this with your friends. Invite them to listen along with you if you like. But we would love to hear more from you. And please send your questions, your suggestions, and if you wish to have a reading with us, please send that along too with your question to theoraclescroll@gmail.com. Bye-bye. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Oracle Scroll. Find us on Facebook at the Oracle Scroll. If you wish to send comments, suggestions, or requests, please address them to theoraclescroll@gmail.com.